Okay, so now we're going to jump over to something entirely different, and that is cloth simulation. But much like the last video, this is going to be a very brief overview. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of, completely representing cloth in the digital space. This is going to be, if you want to get like a crumpled blanket on the floor, here's how to do that. Or a blowing flag, you could also do that, which I think I covered last semester. But so I have a very basic scene here. I have a ground, I have a sphere, which is just there to literally be in the way, and I have a plane, which will be our cloth. And I will even call it cloth because naming is good. And I'll call this in the way, and I will call this the ground. Okay. So in order to do a cloth simulation, obviously you need a mesh, and it's important to have enough detail in the mesh so that you can get a natural deformation, because it's going to be moving the vertices around, but it can't move vertices around that aren't there. So if you only have a mesh that is this dense, you can only fold it so many ways, whereas if you subdivide this a couple of times, you're going to have a whole lot more detail. And we'll look at the difference here in a second. So as far as actually applying cloth modifier, it's relatively straightforward. You just need to go to your effects menu set, and we've got this end cloth tab here, and you just click create end cloth. All right, some things happen in the channel box, and actually it's going to be better to go to the attribute editor here. For this part, you can select your cloth shape, and if you go to presets, you've got a few different options that are great starting points. So let's go with, how about, where is it? T-shirt, right? We're all familiar with what a t-shirt is and how it behaves as a cloth. You see we've got some notes here. Cotton t-shirt is medium weight and friction and is slightly stretchy with relatively damped motion. So these are all descriptors about the quality of cloth and how it behaves. One may yet need to increase the stretch resistance further for high gravity or fast moving objects. If the material seems too springy, try increasing the damp value. So some of these words might sound a little bit foreign to you if you've not done cloth simulation before. These are all referring to different attributes that you can actually adjust. And you can do that in we've got collision. You can see we've got some friction. So friction in cloth is the same way friction works anywhere else. Sandpaper is rougher than marble, right, generally. So some cloth is smooth. Silk is a smoother cloth. It slips around a whole lot more, whereas something like burlap is a very rough cloth or fabric. So you can adjust all of these different things. But once you do that, so we've not actually changed any settings. All right, now if I hit play on the timeline, that's what happens, right? The cloth just falls down to infinity. It doesn't hit anything, because with physical simulations, you basically need to tell Maya which things to include in these simulations, which things need to exist in a physical way. Right, so right now it doesn't know that this sphere is here, or at least the cloth doesn't know that the sphere is there. The cloth is responding to gravity, and it's not responding to any air resistance. Well, you could technically say it is, but because this is a perfect system, there's no turbulence in the air, so it's not going to crumple. But we need to basically tell Maya that this sphere exists. So you're going to select the sphere and go to end cloth and say create passive collider. Again, there are some options. Well, there's an option. We'll just say make collide, and I'll go back to the first frame, hit play again, and now it hits the sphere, bounces off, and it goes through the floor. Why does it go through the floor? Because that is not a real object yet. We need to make that a passive collider as well. Now we go back to frame 1, and the cloth will hit the sphere. You can see it bounces a little bit, and then it slowly slides off the sphere. And it slides off before the end of it. So I'm going to set my timeline end to 500 frames. so we can see a little bit more of this. There we go, and then it'll slowly slide off, and then it'll kind of crumple. Well, it won't crumple too much because there's some bending issues, because you can kind of see the corners in the cloth, and that's because there's not a whole lot of subdivisions in this fabric, and that's where it's going to lay to rest, right? One thing to note, if you really want to visualize this friction, if we max out the friction, when it hits and lands, oh, that actually slid off easier. That is not what I expected to happen. Let's try like 5. There we go. Maybe the weight of the cloth is so much that it's not stopping. Go back to point 1. Okay, so you can see what happens if you have just a very simple plane. Now I'm going to take this plane and subdivide it. Now, what I'm not sure about is if I need to undo the simulation. So I'm going to add 3 divisions, which is quite a bit. And now we can go back to frame 1. Yeah, okay, so it doesn't actually recognize those divisions. So I need to, I'm going to undo all the way back. Or actually, you know what, instead of that, I'll just delete it and add a new plane. It's probably faster. Okay, so we got our new plane. Scale it up. We're going to add some divisions. We'll go 3. That's plenty. 3. There we go. And we will make it a cloth. And we will give it a preset, again, of t-shirt. Replace. Go back to frame 1 and hit play. You can see it's definitely going slower. Oops, let me stop that. So when you are doing cloth sim, make sure you give yourself time, because these can take a fair amount of it. But as it collides with the sphere, you can see there's a lot more detail. We didn't really notice these ripples last time because it was not a very dense mesh. You see, it's also taking a lot longer. Yeah, so you can play around with it with a bunch of these different options. And let's go. I'll go to 1,000 here. Oops. And now, once you have, I'm going to delete the sphere. I'm going to add a cube. So once you have a deformation that you like, because I'm talking about cloth sim in reference to creating a static cloth that does not need to continuously deform and respond. And you see there, I forgot to add a passive collider to the cube. Because we're just trying to get a static cloth that doesn't need to continuously deform and animate and respond to its environment, once we get the simulation and the effect that we want, we can kind of stop it right there. So, need to add another passive collider to the ground because it's responding to a different simulation now. Okay, just make sure this is centered where I want it. Good. All right. So I'm going to let this simulate, and then when it gets to a point that I like, I'll show you how to bake that into the cloth and kind of keep it holding that shape. So you can see now it hits the ground and the cube, and it's going to continue to respond. It'll probably slide off the cube, I'm guessing. but actually that's a really nice spot right there. Okay, so there's our cloth deformation. And if you hit 3 on the keyboard, now it's really starting to look pretty nice, right? So if I go back to frame 1, this is going to go right back to a flat plane. If I want to actually keep this in this shape, what I need to do is delete the history on the cloth. So I'm going to select the cloth and go to Edit, Delete by Type History. I've done that now. If I go back to frame 1, you can see nothing happens because this is now the shape of the cloth. All right, I can delete this cube, and that cloth is still there. All right, that's just what it is now. Okay, so that's the really simple cloth simulation overview. Okay, so just as an alternative, as far as freezing the shape of the cloth, I'm going to undo the delete history. Okay, so now I'm back to my simulation. And Cam suggested, once I get back to a frame that is good. Oops, zoom in here. Let that get a little bit rougher. Okay. You can duplicate the mesh. All right, look at our outliner here. Duplicate the mesh, and I'm going to just isolate it here so I can only focus on that. And now, once I duplicate it, oops, keep forgetting I'm not in Premiere. Once I duplicate it, it stays static. At this point, you will still have the simulation there, so you can either keep it hidden on a layer and just if you need to go back and resimulate for whatever reason. Otherwise, you can just delete them. And I believe if you go to, if you freeze the transformation, no, that's still in there. So we just go into the outliner and delete all the things that you don't need, and you still have your lovely cloth. So that's one way. Now, as an alternative, if instead of having a cloth falling, what you can do is if you want, for instance, a flag. So oops, not a cube. I want a plane. This will be our flag. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, and then I'm going to give it a width of 3, a height of 2, 20 there. So roughly average flag shape. And we will move it up because flags belong up above the ground. And again, I will add some divisions. I think 2 will be plenty in this instance. Okay. Now, if I just hit simulation, because we'll go to create end cloth and just hit play. It's just going to fall to the ground because there's no colliders. But a flag doesn't really have any colliders, but it still needs to stay up in the air. So what you need to do is apply a constraint. So I'm going to select a couple of vertices in the corners. So we'll say maybe those 4 and these 4, right? And I'm going to go up to end constraint and transform constraint. All right, it's going to stop those vertices from moving. Now I can hit play, and you'll see how the cloth responds. Now it's going to get super stretchy because I didn't give it a preset, and this is just a silly amount of stretch. So I'm going to hit stop, select the cloth, go back to my attribute editor and give it a preset. We'll stick with t-shirt because we're familiar with it and how it behaves. Okay, now I'll hit play again, and we'll see how that's going to go. Still stretching a little bit more than I would like. So I'm going to stop. Let's do a couple things. Let's try silk. Silk is a little bit lighter, so it theoretically won't pull quite as much. Still going quite a bit there. So we'll increase stretch resistance. The other thing that you can do with, or that you probably should do with flags a little bit, is add in some wind. And the nice thing about Cloth Sim in Maya is you don't have to add a separate particle system or separate environmental system to get wind. You just need to go to the Nucleus tab. Whoops, which I went too far. There it is, Nucleus 1. And now we have this gravity and wind section. So I'm just going to bump the wind speed up. We'll say it at like 10. And the wind direction, so these are X, Y, and Z coordinates. So it's full on in the X direction, so that way. I'm going to push it a little bit also in the Z direction, like 0.2, just so you can tell it's doing something. And then add a little bit of noise to the wind, so it's not quite so regular. And hit play. And we'll see how this goes. It is still stretching quite a bit. I'm going to stop this. Go back. Oops, stop. This computer really does not like recording video and simulating cloth at the same time. Okay. Back to 1. Vertex, and I will just select all of these and go and add a transform constraint to all of them. There we go. And now it's looking a little bit more like a flag. It's still stretching a lot, so you'll have to play around with the specific values, and those values will vary based on scale and how much you're pinning and what material type preset you have, and all sorts of different things. But you can get some really nice effects this way. So I'll let it go for a little bit, let this ripple kind of make its way across the flag, hopefully get a little bit of irregularity in it. Yeah.
Vertexes or the edges that you constrain?
Here's what I'm going to do, just for the sake of this recording, is I'm going to redo this flag with a less dense mesh. Because it's just not loving this. I've got a slightly less dense flag here, so this should. Oh, I don't think the transform constraint's stuck. So let me add that back real quick. Constrain, transform constraint. There we go. Back to 1. That's better. It's going a lot faster. It's looking like a flag. So we'll find a spot that we like, and again, we can save it in whichever way we want. So that's good right there. Okay. So I got my object, and then I'm just going to duplicate it and oops. Let's make sure we have the correct one. Go to my outliner. There we go. That's the one I want. Solo that. 3 on the number pad. And there is our cloth. Now at this point, what I would probably do is select all the faces and just do a little bit of an extrusion to give it some thickness. Oops. Oh, undo that. Sorry. Extrude. And okay. Not a fan of that. We undo that and let's make sure we edit. We'll delete the history. We'll make sure we freeze transformations. Whoops. There we go. And let's try that again. Ooh, no. There we go. Local translate works a lot better. Get something very subtle, like 0.01 is just fine. And so now that flag has some thickness to it as well. Okay, and there is our simulated static flag.